mute themselves and to turn cameras off, please, and only turn your camera on when you are contributing to the meeting. It just aids the streaming of it, I believe. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's nice to see everybody, albeit virtual, and I don't suppose it's come as any real surprise to any of us that we're back in this position of having to meet virtually. I have to say I was very disappointed as chair that we weren't able to meet or at least have a hybrid meeting, but I do understand the reason for it all being online now. So you're all going to have to bear with me. It's a reasonably large meeting, so chairing it online is going to be a challenge for me. So please bear with me this morning. But welcome to everybody, and welcome to the Mayor and to Councillor Bob Slay, and giving their time up this morning so that we can put some questions to them around the proposed up and coming budget. So do we have any apologies for absence, Lindsay?
Yes, Chair. Apologies received from Councillor Paul Sweet.
Okay, thank you. And obviously this isn't a decision-making meeting, so recommendations will go forward to the board in January. So in terms of being in the room and quorums and all the rest of it, that's less important. Any declarations of interest, just reminding members the need to disclose any prejudicial interests. You can see that on your agenda pack. So do I have any declarations of interest from anybody? No, I'm not seeing any hands. Now, just to make things easier as the meeting progresses, please, if anybody has got a question that they want to ask, please raise a hand rather than putting it in the chat. It just makes it easier for me to see. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the Mayor for an opening statement, and also to Councillor Slay to add anything into that statement. So handing over to you, Andy.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And like you, I regret that we're having to do it virtually, but I'm sure we will still have a good inquiry over the next period. So I can be quite brief in my introductory comments because we would like to get into the discussion always. And the other reason I think I can be quite brief is that the pack, I hope you feel the pack put together by the Finance Directorate really does give you lots and lots of meat. It's all there. So I'm sure that will stimulate the questions. And I should just say right at the beginning, thank you to the finance team for what they've done. I'd probably just like to make 4 points, though, really, in advance of the discussion. The first, and it's a blindingly obvious one, but I think it's only right that we do just acknowledge this, that we're in a good position coming into this in terms of financial management, in that we have now achieved 4 years in a row where we have landed absolutely on the budget, almost to the pound, and the latest forecast says that that is what we will do in this, the 5th year. So that should give people confidence that actually we are capable of budgeting and then living within it and achieving our goals within it. But the second point is, of course, we face an incredible period of uncertainty around the transport income line. And as everyone can see from the pack, this is of huge importance to the whole of the combined authorities budgeting. You will have seen the situation with the projected deficit in transport, which is very much to do with the shortage of patronage arising from COVID. So compared to when we did this 12 months ago, and we thought we would probably see a restoration of passenger numbers in 2021, and that we'd sort of come through it, I think it is now much more questionable. Of course, the government has made good the shortfalls in transport income through 21, but their current position is that that will not continue after April 22, hence the uncertainty coming into our budget in a way in which it did not this time last year. And of course, it's against that background that leaders have agreed with the Deputy Mayor and myself that we should do a 1-year budget solution, which is done, and that's all there in the pack, and we can talk that through. It's very much around focusing on core areas of activity, seeking efficiencies in the organisation, as every public body must do, but also making sure we do invest behind the areas of growth. Third point I'd make, though, and this also comes out well in the pack, is that our budget is actually relatively small from a revenue point of view compared to the authorities that you all come from. But actually the significance of it is what it leverages in terms of capital investment. And if you look at some of those numbers, which are also in the pack, in housing, we're over £500 million investment. In transport, obviously, we've got the whole question of this £1 billion that's been agreed in CRSTS, that sexy title, and how we do that. And of course, the adult education budget is also substantial. So the thing I want us to think about as we have this conversation is not just our own revenue, but the leverage, which is much, much greater. And then the last point sort of builds on from that. I'm also wanting us to think, and there's a real challenge to the organisation, which the Audit and Risk Committee, to be fair, have talked about often, is that this is a growing organisation with growing capital budgets, growing responsibilities, and of course we're now on the verge of the Levelling Up White Paper, and we hope a further devolution deal for the West Midlands as agreed by the leaders on the board cross-party. If we do that, the organisation grows its capability further. And we have got to be thinking through this budgeting process about how we're enabling us to do that and being confident we can deliver basically what we're being asked, what we're asking for, and what we're being empowered to do. So there's a sort of capability and reassurance that we're properly equipped to do that underlying all this as well. That's all I want to say, Kathy, by way of introduction.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy, for that. Bob, is there anything that you want to come in and add to before we move into the questions?
Only a couple of points, Chair. We will, of course, be presenting a balanced budget to the full board in January before the final approval in February. And I think that is important, and undoubtedly that's due, and I hope we all acknowledge this, to the work of Linda and the team in the finance and within the whole organisation, basically. So I think, although we're only producing a one-year budget on this occasion, I don't think that'll be unique to us. I think other local authorities and authorities may be in a similar position. I think it is important to know that it will be balanced. And as the Mayor quite rightly says, we have balanced every year for the last 4 years. And again, due to strong financial management within the organisation. The pressures are evident. The Mayor's already emphasised the issue around transport patronage. And of course, that has lowered the revenue streams for us. And in the current situation we're in, of course, that may continue. And I think the other point he makes, which is very important, is that government funding to support transport will actually, unless there's a change in government thinking, run out around April of next year. I suppose that's all I need to say at this point in time, Chair. We'll go to questions if you so wish.
Okay, thank you very much. And I should have said at the outset that this meeting is being recorded and will be on YouTube. So that's just for people's information. Okay, then, yes, and I'd like to say thank you to the finance team for the extremely helpful briefing and workshop that they gave us, and the very comprehensive budget briefing pack that we've received from them. It has been extremely helpful in us as a committee putting together some lines of questioning that we would like to put to yourselves. So on that, I'm going to bring in Councillor Ditchico from Solihull with the first question on sustainability of the budget.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Andy and Bob. First of all, well done to you and your team on delivering a balanced budget in these difficult times. I know it's very trying for all of us, the West Midlands Combined Authority and local authorities at the moment, given the situation we're in. So well done on that. And the first question I've got is, are you satisfied that the budget you will propose to the West Midlands Combined Authorities Board matches the ambition of the West Midlands Combined Authority and its political leadership?
Do you want me to go first, Chair?
Yeah.
I think I'll just jump in unless Bob stops me at any point, or you steer in terms of the. Okay. So the answer is yes, actually. And let me explain what I mean by that. At the moment, we need to take this conversation in two parts, the transport part and the other parts. The transport part, a critical point, is at the moment the budget defends all of the current services operated and all of the subsidies and concessions. And when we've had these meetings before, we've joined hands politically to say that's what has to be done. That is currently done. But to be very straightforward with you, Tony, the risk lies in the transport line. And if the patronage falls away massively during next year, and it compared to what we think it's going to be, and if the government doesn't step in with further funding, we will face a very, very difficult situation, because we effectively have to make good those shortfalls. Directly in Metro, obviously, because we run it, and indirectly in bus, because we will be faced with a situation of, do we pay for the services that National Express and their other operators are no longer willing to do commercially? So there is a huge risk in that. But as it stands at the moment, the budget sustains the services and sustains all the concessions. So yes, I'm comfortable with that. And I have to say, this is eyes absolutely wide open amongst all the leaders. We've explained this risk, everybody understands, and I hope everyone will go together in supporting this. On the other side of it, the non-transport budget, my answer is yes. And obviously this is much smaller than the transport budget, but actually we are able to fund the key areas of activity. And I think it's actually been a good process that we've been careful that we don't sort of stray. Sometimes people call it mission creep. So the core teams around housing, around skills, around net zero, that's very important that there's proper resourcing for that in here. And we've seen some advantage of the CA's central resource here, helping local authorities bid for the funding that was agreed yesterday for retrofit. So bottom line, yes, I am comfortable we've been able to do what we have to do.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there any follow-up questions on that?
Can I pick up on that? And I suppose it partly addresses how you've sought to differentiate between the transport budget and the remaining budget heads. I mean, clearly this time last year, we were assured that we would be receiving a multi-year budget and that we would be moving forward to a sustainable period for the combined authority with a clear sense of direction. Elections behind us, able to all be clear of where we're going. And indeed, you've produced a corporate plan. Now, the corporate plan sets out your priorities for the end of this term. You have a budget again that is 1 year. So I actually think your corporate plan being for the period of your term and a 1 year budget actually contradicts in part your view that we can be confident in the delivery on your priorities. Where I suppose I'm also coming from is we are clearly in challenging times. We can leverage capital across the piece, and leveraging capital's not hard, as I know. Actually finding the revenue to help deliver it and the capacity and capability to ensure it's targeted at the right places is even less so. So I suppose I'm quite interested from your experience in running a large and complex organisation in the private sector, how are you intending to bring a little bit more fiscal stability to the combined authority?
Okay. So sorry, there's some feedback.
Yeah, can I just ask that everybody mutes themselves and turns off cameras if you're not contributing, please?
So, okay, it's a very fair question, Lisa. And I don't think either Bob or I wanted to be presenting a 1 year budget. We certainly wanted to do a medium-term financial plan, but we haven't been able to because of the enormous uncertainty in the transport piece. But I think the reason for distinguishing it from the rest of the activities is that if you look at the corporate plan and our aims there, we have been able to resource each of those activities, and there's almost like a direct line to the budget. And that's why I answered Tony's question positively. So in the aims, it actually does talk very specifically about what will be actually done under each of those. And the sort of read my lips moment is that we have got the resource in the non-transport area to deliver those items. And this is what I mean about it's been quite a tough debate actually with leaders, because some of the other things that some might have said we should do or indeed some of our own officers might have wanted to do, we've not been able to extend to. But that's okay, because we've now got alignment between what we say we're going to do in those corporate aims and objectives and the budget lines. The reason for the problem is the uncertainty in the transport line.
So are you absolutely clear that if it was not for transport, that transport alone is your challenge in terms of your budget?
Yes, I am clear on that. And if you just think about the logic of this, the total revenue expenditure in the non-transport area is about 15-16 million. Okay, and we definitely can cover that with the use of the business rates piece, as has been done, and that was always planned that that business rates piece would come in right back to 2016. So there is not a deficit underlying on that piece. The big risk is around the transport piece.
Okay, we do have a block of transport questions following on from the sustainability of the budget. So the detail around that will be picked up in that as we move through the questions. Bob?
Yeah, can I just add, I think one significant development, and I think the Mayor touched on it, is clearly the approval, certainly through the scrutiny process and the board, of the aims and objectives going forward for the board, because that directly drives into the medium-term financial plan going forward. It identifies what we are proposing to do, and I think now we align those aims and objectives to the resources we have available to us. And I would support the Mayor's position. I think we are in this position due to the transport patronage issue, which is fundamental. On the non-transport activity, I think we've done some key work to identify what are our core priorities within that, and that's clearly around skills, and it's clearly around 5G, for instance, and there is an ongoing discussion as to the support for those. But I think we've got a clear path to ensure the non-transport element can be funded, as the Mayor quite rightly says, in the core priorities that we've identified.
Does anybody have any supplementary questions on that particular item that they wish to put to the Mayor or Councillor Slay? Councillor Akhtar?
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, Mayor mentioned mission creep, and I think he mentioned it in other areas as well, but we can clearly see the main objective of setting up a combined authority was to bring skill into the region and more additional funding. But what I have seen is over the last couple of years since you took over as a mayor, that we are heading towards a two-tier authority in the region, which we would not like to see that in the region, the two-tier authority. For example, where the housing and homelessness come into this, that is the statutory duty of the local authority. Where the health and well-being coming into the combined authority, where the adult education comes to combined authority. I think we are losing the focus of the main objective, which was to bring the additional funding into the region, upskill the region, and improve the transport. All other thing we are looking now here is the statutory duty of the local combined authority, to deal with, not the combined authority. Thank you.
Andy, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I will come back on that. So the first thing I would say is that the deck, so these are not my numbers, they're Linda's numbers. The deck does talk about the additional cash that has been brought in through the combined authority over the last 4 years. That number's there. I think the number quoted in this pack is 4.7 billion. So it's quite clear that that has happened. Second thing, I have to just disagree with you, Councillor, a little, because although there are the core deliverables, which you have correctly described around transport, skills, housing, and we can talk if we wish about the progress or otherwise in each of those areas, the original devolution deal was absolutely clear. There was also a requirement to look at the greater efficiency and deliverable in public services. It is the second line of the devolution deal struck with government. Now, what we've had to do, and this is where the mission creep conversation is real, and I'll be entirely honest with you, because of course local authorities have statutory roles and we have to respect those. But there are also opportunities for the combined authority to do something additional to what the local authorities are doing. You mentioned homelessness. I happen to think it's an extremely good example of where that has been done with the Homelessness Task Force, which is independently led and has been able to bring work about, such as the Housing First programme, which has definitely made a difference. And the way it does it is it works with all of the local authorities. Right, so it's not an either or, it's an additional to, it's with. And frankly, that I think is the model in this public service area. It's a good model. And what we've got to do is make sure we don't stray into areas where we can't add that additionality. And there's a constant pushback, quite rightly, to the combined authority not to do that. And what I think local authorities have got to do is be honest about where that additionality and working together can add to their efforts.
Okay, so I've got Councillor Slay followed by Councillor Trickett.
Yeah, I can just add to that. I mean, the Mayor's absolutely right. The original devolution deal was quite clear that although we focus very much on skills, transport, housing and all of those other issues, that there is clearly a responsibility that the devolution deal applied to us to look at some of the additional benefits that we can bring to some of the public sector elements within the operations of the West Midlands and the geography in which we work. And a clear example of that, which came out, of course, of the Mental Health Commission, is the whole Thrive programme. Now, that is delivered at scale across the wider geography of the West Midlands. Yes, each local authority can sign up to that and be part of that. But at this scale, we are adding quite a lot in developing a programme that I think has proved successful. We have a wellbeing portfolio, and it's very conscious that we don't, you know, as I think Councillor Akhtar talked about, we don't want to move into the area of mission creep, but where we can offer additionality at the scale in which we operate and lever in the resources to do that, I think that's a practical demonstration of where our role in some of those public sector elements is demonstrated. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Trickett.
Thanks, Kathy. I suppose where I'm concerned, I'll pick up on the example you've given, and I was going to touch on this later, but I might as well reference it now, that you've referenced the Homelessness Task Force, and it's been independently funded. I'm sure it's been independently chaired, and I know there's been work done across the local authorities. Where I then come to in terms of the budget is, if that is highlighting, and as we know, we have thousands of families in bed and breakfast, and we know the impact that has upon children's education, mental health and well-being, I find it slightly bizarre that when I look through the budget, I don't see money actually being distinctly targeted at this issue. And indeed, when I look at the housing investment and the housing numbers, I see that where we may be increasing housing numbers, we're actually decreasing the number of affordable housing that is available. So if you're talking about efficiency and effectiveness, then my suggestion would be that so far in terms of addressing some of the key costs to society and individuals and the public purse, actually the way you have managed your investment in housing has not necessarily been efficient or effective.
Okay, thank you for the question, because it actually enables me to try to explain two things. The second one of which I suspect won't satisfy you, Lisa, but I will still explain it.
I'm not easy to satisfy, I do assure you. It's not just you.
When I said in my introductory remarks, a lot of this was about leverage and us drawing in other funds that then don't appear anywhere in this budget. We will just stick with this homelessness one as a really good example of this, as again, both Lisa and I have raised it. There's not a line in this budget which says work on homelessness. But there is a separate budget that the CA manages, which is actually the Housing First programme, which has actually been like the sort of perhaps the outstanding piece of work of the Homelessness Task Force, which is a central government funded piece that we came together to win and actually that budget pays for the activity. So it doesn't appear here anywhere, but it is work that we, with cash, that we have been able to secure. I think the way it actually appears here is one member of Ed Cox's team who is tasked with this overall programme, but most of it is paid for separately. And this is what I mean about building the capability of the organisation, because different areas actually have those funds that aren't even reflected in here. What we do have to make sure in this relatively limited page 29, 13.2 million, we've got the head counts in the core team that are then able to go about securing and managing some of these budgets that sit out with. And that is a legitimate area to look at, to say, is that set up properly? Back to Lisa's previous question. But it's a good example of the leverage point. Now, the second area about actual housing, again, this I think is, there's 2 points to make here. The first actually is if you look through this budget on page 29 of the resources here, there is almost nothing. Well, it says nothing for housing and regeneration, nil. Now, that doesn't mean we have no people working on it and we're not doing anything. But what's actually happened is the whole of the housing and regeneration team has become self-funding by top slicing the funding that we have been able to draw in. So again, it's a wonderful example of this question of the maturing organisation, the capability. So we're actually being able to do all the work we do around housing, and Lisa acknowledged the number of homes being built was going up without any cost on here because of the way in which Gareth Bradford and his team have organised that. And in a sense, it's a model of good practice.
But with respect, Andy, I capitalised housing teams in the past and regeneration teams, and that comes at a cost. That comes at a cost of making decisions and deals with developers that bring you maybe your numbers, but not your social housing.
Yeah.
So I come back to, does this budget and does your model actually deliver what this region needs?
Yeah, that's just, I was coming to that, Lisa, and that's the bit where I think you and I are going to probably not agree. But in terms of explaining where the resource is to do all this work, that's why I wanted to come to the nil on page 29 and back to that wider point. Now, in terms of the homes being built, and we've talked about this at these committees before, we are making a progress on the affordable homes. We are not yet making progress on sufficient social housing. I agree with you there, Lisa. I don't actually think that is a reflection of how this team operates and the budget piece that's there. I actually think it's a reflection of the funding that we have thus far been able to secure from central government and what's to be done. So we have, as we previously said, put in applications to have a GLA style deal that has not yet been secured. It is absolutely something we wish to do, but what of course has happened since the last discussion we had is the government have now agreed £8.1 billion that they have put into the hands of housing associations around the country. Of that 8.1, we got 1.1, and our housing associations are now relatively well funded and have to deliver the mix, large proportion of which is social housing, to actually spend that. And what we will be doing is working with them to accelerate that expenditure. So I'm hoping to see a much greater proportion of the total homes being social homes as they have now got that funding.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So is that being delivered through the affordable housing vehicle then, Andy? That will that be delivered through that vehicle?
Okay, so lots here. So the government's deal with the housing associations is direct. Okay, let's be clear. We do not have a role within that. However, the collaboration that we have signed up with a number of the housing associations in that partnership, that is designed to accelerate the pace at which that goes. So, for example, if there's land transactions to be done, we help them spend the cash that they have got. So in that sense, the answer is yes. But to be really clear, the funding flow is straight from government to them.
Can I just, picking up on Kathy's point, are you confident that in your evolving investment vehicle, you have actually got the housing associations with the large allocations from government for social housing?
The answer to that is yes. The answer
You have. So there is no
Yeah.
housing association outside your partnership
No.
who has a significant
No,
development.
no, no. That's a slightly different question. So not all of the housing associations in the West Midlands that have received cash directly from government are in our housing association partnership, but the biggest are. There's no problem here, actually, if you'd like us just to...
It's about the size. It's not the size of the association, it's their size of their budget and what they do with their budget to meet the needs of the citizens of our region.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So this is all new, and it's been very interesting that actually this has had very little press, it's had very little scrutiny, but it's a very large sum of money. What I'd be very happy to do is to, for this committee and indeed the Housing and Land Board, just go through exactly who's got what. It is in the public domain and who is in our vehicle, because I think there's not a perfect crossover, Lisa, you're right, but the biggest one, the ones in our vehicle are amongst those that have received the most money from government.
Okay, happily to pick that up.
Yeah, that would be very helpful, particularly as we did call in the original discussion about the affordable housing vehicle. Councillor Slay?
Just to add a little bit of context, the current funding that Andy speaks about over and above the housing association partnership elements is in essence controlled or administered through the investment board within the combined authority. And on the issue of affordable housing, these are proposals that are brought forward to us through the Housing Land Fund or through the Brownfield Land Property Development Fund or the other funds that are administered primarily by Gareth's operation to decide whether we will invest in those propositions. We don't generate the propositions, they're brought forward primarily through developers or through local authorities. And the affordability element within that is actually mirrored within the local plans that each local authority bring forward. And when we feel there's some deficiency in that, and we have in fact applied our own 20% criteria on affordability when some authorities have got a lesser figure, and we very seriously look at that. And I think it's a constant debate now in the investment board when housing development is brought forward. What is the percentage of affordable housing within that particular proposal? And that's the basis on which we actually, amongst other criteria, determine whether we will support the Housing and Land Fund investments or the Brownfield Land Property Development Fund. It's not part of the revenue budget, as the Mayor quite rightly says. It is separately held within the portfolios who actually have the responsibility for ensuring it's clear and safe and transparent distribution.
Okay, Councillor Waters.
Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, Vera.
My question is, now this budget for social housing, is this just solely for rental, or does this include part rent, part buy?
It's a mix. The individual housing associations decide what they wish to do on that, but most of their models will be a mix. I think what we need to do here, Vera, is it comes to Lisa's question. We need to do almost like a briefing on what's been agreed and what is now likely to happen. And the third bit is, and what role have we got to accelerate this?
Lisa?
Just to pick up on this, and we will take it back into, we are undertaking a review of housing, and clearly this discussion is certainly focused my mind. I think where I come from, and I absolutely accept, Bob, your point that you're not convening or driving the propositions. One of the difficulties that we then have is the nature of your approach leads to a market-led approach. And actually what we have found in this region is that the market-led approach is not actually serving the needs of our residents in terms of the development of affordable housing. And inevitably, if you're going through an investment pipeline, what you will have is you will have the propositions that are being put together by the big developers with very good confidence in what actually is going to come out at the end, rather than some of those more marginal schemes that deliver the social housing and potentially the broader social value for our area. So it comes back to my point of convening for what purpose. You can leverage money, but if you leverage money that actually just goes straight out into the hands of the developers and doesn't actually deliver the social housing, then actually the value of your leverage is diminished.
So let's just pick that up, because I don't believe we've just left a market solution at all. The whole purpose of the CA and its housing funds has actually been to intervene in a market. So it's been, I accept it's working with the private sector developers, that's true, but it actually is very interventionist approach. And I think there's two ways in which real social value has been delivered unquestionably. The first is that our cash has nearly all gone on brownfield sites, which tend to be regeneration and tend to be then gluing back communities, if that doesn't sound rather a strange way of describing it, restoring fill-in places between communities. I mean, a lovely story just in the press on Friday, which Vera will know well, Walsall, the development of the old Caparo site, actually properties now becoming available. And that actually glues back that Birch Hills community. So there's huge social value in what's happened there. And the other area where there's been real intervention is our absolute demand over the proportion of affordable housing. And we won't go over it all again. We've redefined affordable here, and we've now got that up to new stat for you. We've now got that up to an average of 25% across our developments. And some, it is very clear that our money has actually moved that percentage more like 60, 70. A couple of the schemes in Sandwell that just been done, that's the case. So that's been very interventionist. I accept, and Bob made this clear, it has not yet brought a high proportion of social housing, but that's where the housing association cash and the partnership will now, I hope, drive that. And that's what we need to, I think, properly brief on.
Okay, thank you. So if we can move on, then I'm not seeing any other hands from anybody. So I've got a question for you. So as a publicly funded authority, it's important that we are honest and transparent about risks contained within that budget.
Yes.
You've talked about the transport risks. Can you talk about any other risks that have been factored into next year's draft budget?
So interesting question, and I know Bob will have a lot to say on this because he covers this, but I don't know if you've been given this, Chair. I've got in my hand something called the Strategic Risk Register.
Yeah, we've got.
Have you shared that? So in a sense, all of those things have been are called out, first of all, hopefully honestly, and the Audit and Risk Committee grills the Chief Executive of the organisation, and Laura might want to say something about this, or Linda, very, very thoroughly on this. So everything from data protection, where obviously as a public body we have a big responsibility, through to the financial assumptions underlying the investment programme and the degree of risk we're taking in our investments there. So there are, frankly, there are a lot of risks and they are monitored. But it is, I think the transport one is just such a clear immediate revenue risk. It's sort of a different status, if that makes sense, Kathy. But yeah, these are monitored frequently and the degree of movement in them is monitored.
Okay. Bob, is there anything you wanted to add to
that? Just to add, obviously we're all conscious of cost inflation, particularly with some of the investments we've actually made, and clearly we monitor those very carefully to ensure that that they do and maintain within budget, and we have a very clear process in place if there's any slippage in that. Just with regard to the investment programme itself, or rather the funds administered by the investment board, we of course tend to be at the front end of the investment development, so our costs are capped in most cases because we are really developing up to ground level before the actual construction work starts. So we're very clear in our approach that we are managing the risk with regard to our investments on a very regular basis, and I'm sure Linda knows all the finer technical detail of all of this, and she's very proficient in telling us what it is, but that from my perspective is how we actually do it. And it did again come up at the investment board only this week as to how we were monitoring cost inflation, particularly with regard to materials and other such matters. So it is something we watch consistently.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on then, can I bring in Councillor Trickett to ask a further question, Lisa?
So I suppose it picks up a little bit on what we've discussed. You've clearly secured your next mayoral term. What I'm actually interested in is what you were saying in your manifesto. How is that translated into the budget? Are the things that you were committing to in the manifesto that you have now been able to directly show through in the revenue budget?
Yes, the answer, yes. So I mean, it's a small example, but it's very current, so you'll see how this works. So we talked about really further work around the active travel, cycling and walking. We talked about a commissioner to do that. Lo and behold, that person is appointed. They're in the budget going forward. So that would be a very practical example, very immediate example of something that's happened. But probably a far bigger example is obviously we talked about the 100,000 jobs. We talked about the need for skills and retraining around that. So what the skills team are doing and how they are resourced is designed to achieve exactly that. So I suppose, and I actually am going to probably ask Laura to give an answer to this, because what was been gone through since May the 6th is exactly taking my manifesto alongside all the local authority objectives as well. I don't think it's the only thing that's been done, and actually making sure that the executive then have in their plans the way that that is going to be achieved. So there's been a very thorough process around it. So Laura, do you just want to confirm that the organisation has done that and how you've done it?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Chair. What we've done is obviously to set that out. I think this this body has also seen the corporate aims and objectives, and so that was the process by which we incorporated not only what we've been asked to do by the Combined Authority Board, but the other aims and objectives that have been discussed. We've put those into a set of aims and objectives for the next 12 months, and those have been signed off by the board. So I can assure the committee that all of those have been both incorporated and have been endorsed by the board and are set out through that process.
Okay, so in your manifesto, there was clearly a range of proposals and policies developed that arguably the current one-year budget isn't reflective of. Were there assumptions within your budget that a precept would be set this year in your manifesto? No,
the opposite. But there was also, if I'm very honest, when the manifesto was written, there was an assumption that the transport budget would not have the potential hole in that it has, because obviously at that point we believed that the government had protected transport revenue until the end of this financial year, and we believed, and there was evidence of this, that the patronage numbers were improving. And just let us remember that before the last couple of weeks we got back to 60% on rail. We got back out before the metro suspension. We were some days running over 100%, and on bus we were running about 75%. So the assumptions that underpin the manifesto was that we would not have this risk around the transport piece. That's what's changed.
Okay, we had got a number of questions actually on the mayoral precepts, so I guess this opens, opens the discussion quite nicely. Yeah. So given that there is no mayoral precept for this year, and I understand from the briefing we received that that was a collective leadership decision.
Yes.
What's your own personal view on setting a precept, given the amount that it would potentially generate for the region, and the current risks that you've highlighted, the very serious risks in transport? So what's your view on whether or not a precept would actually be valuable for that?
With pleasure. Let me just say one other thing about, before I just come head on to that question. And Councillor Ian Courts, leader of Solihull, put this incredibly well at the leaders' meeting. And he said if the mayor was never invented, if the CA was never invented, the 7 metropolitan authorities would face this problem over transport in the West Midlands. And it's worth remembering that in all of this conversation. The levy system was set up well before the CA was formed. And what would actually be being faced was the fact that the levy is not sufficient for the transport desires, really, of the Mets with the risk. So I do think before we come to the precept, we have to face into that. And that's why it's really important to me that we've started to increase the transport levy. Because you've seen the data, it's been going down for a number of years, then held steady for a number of years, whereas actually what we've been delivering has gone up. And there's a great credit to the efficiency of TFWM in that. So I draw that out, Kathy, because I think that's a really important point, that we can't escape the levy conversation and the transport budget come what may. If we then come to the precept, I'll give you a very straightforward answer to this because it's what I wrote in both manifestos, both in 2017 and 2021. I see it very much as a last resort. I wouldn't wish to do it in any way because, frankly, it's another tax on very hard-pressed taxpayers at the moment. And we can all see the squeeze that's occurring at the moment. And that's why there was cross-party agreement that this was not the right time to do it. But we may have to do it in the future if the risks come to pass in the transport budget and we are not able to move the levy. So it is there in the back pocket, but it will be absolutely the last resort as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so obviously it's been confirmed that that was a cross-party decision. And the details that we've got in the document pack go back to, it was drafted in February 2018. So the estimated yield was 7.72 million, and that was based on 2018 figures. So they obviously may be different. But 7.72 million in the current climate of deficit is a significant amount of money. That, you know, I would think it puts us in a difficult, or it puts the leaders in a position of having to consider what they continue to do, what they prioritise to do, versus what they take out of the action plans going forward. Because if we are, you know, I'm presuming that that 7.72 million would actually allow significant delivery of projects that may have to be ceased because that funding hasn't been raised.
Yeah, so to be clear, and this goes right back to Tony's very first question, we do not need it for what we wish to do this year. So we have the cash to do the projects that we wish to do this year. And as I've already said, some of it's visible in the budget, some of it's actually elsewhere. But we have managed to square that, and that's why I'm hoping that we will get unanimous support for the budget for this year. So there's not a question of ceasing things because we haven't done it this year. But that you are absolutely right to draw out that when we look at the subsequent years, if further risk comes to pass, we might have to turn to this, and that's why it is an option on the table.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Hare, are you wanting to come in?
Yes, Chair. Andy, the question to you is that what is the total budget, and can it be split down by the region? And I'd like to know how much the Coventry going to get. Okay, have you got any specific figure for us, please?
Much.
Right. So the totals are obviously revenue and capital. So let's just go through it. The budget for next year on transport revenue is 124 million, page 28, all the detail there. The non-transport revenue is 29, on page 29 is 13.2, but as I've already said, there are other things that are added to that. And then the capital sums are also a little further through the pack. Just getting the exact number on the capital. It is on page 36, and next year's capital, and this really does illustrate the sort of leverage point, is 752 million is the expected expenditure next year. So those are the three total sums. Okay, and You know, we are in a very different situation in terms of balance of revenue to capital than the local authorities are. Very, very different situation. Proves what we're supposed to be doing. Now, in terms of how that is broken down, we do not have a breakdown of the revenue by different local authorities. We have had a breakdown of the capital since the formation of the CA by different local authorities and also going forward. And I haven't got the Coventry number off the top of my head, but I can absolutely promise you that on any examination, Coventry has done very, very well. And lots of other authorities would say Coventry's done too well. So per head of population, I think Coventry is top. So we can get that number for you. It's been in the public domain, but please be reassured, Coventry has had an extremely good share of the pie.
Well, in the past, Andy, large share always you give it to Birmingham rather than other region. That's what the people think about.
That's so okay. I'm glad that's been said, because, and I know that Coventrians have that view, but it is not true. I mean, Birmingham is a bigger city by a long way than anywhere else, and so quite rightly, it has the biggest total sum. But if you look at it per head, there's absolutely no question that Coventry has had, if you do it purely on a mathematical thing, and I'm not making any judgment, but more than its fair share. And I'm more than happy to show any Coventry in those numbers. You have had a very, very good deal from the CA.
It's actually in the pack, and I was just trying to scroll through to see what page it was, but I haven't managed to come across it. But it's actually in the pack where it shows per head of population across the whole of all 7 Mets.
Good, thank you very much, Chair.
Are there any other questions around mayoral precepts then? Lisa?
I suppose I had, and again, so that we could, in true cross-party style, I think, I would have to reflect that our Black Country review actually showed that possibly Coventry did get, as you've said, Andy, more than its fair share. Because actually what we are seeing is it's those really deprived areas and the areas that need that transition that potentially we need to be targeting investment at. And I suppose, again, I am hoping we will see over the forthcoming year in the budget setting that we will be targeting and drilling down into those areas with absolute need.
That's fair. There you are, Councillor Hare. You've heard it from someone other than me that Coventry's had a good share.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, telling me. And I hope Coventry will get a fair share as we got it before.
You will definitely. Yeah.
Okay, Andy, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then, so if we move on. Councillor Dishico, I've got a question from yourself to ask.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just a question around funding, government funding, Andy. I'd like to know your views on the current practice of basically always having to bid to government for funding to do anything.
With pleasure.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be a sustainable way of doing business, and in itself probably a costly way to operate. So what representations are you making to governments and the other combined authorities to basically address this issue?
Yeah, no, thank you, Tony. It's a really interesting question. You were very polite in how you described it. I think it's a nonsense of a way of proceeding, really, for a couple of key reasons. The first is that it's incredibly wasteful of resources. We're all busy writing bids, local authorities are writing bids, LEPs are writing bids, and then there are civil servants in London assessing them all. And frankly, a lot of it is wasted effort. And I cannot believe that the civil service time is best spent deciding whether a roundabout in Solihull should be funded or not. And it just seems wrong to me. And then, of course, the other reason that it's not right is that it moves away from the whole sort of founding principle of both the LEPs when they first came in, and then the CA, and indeed local authorities would say the same, that you work to a strategy and you work and you make sure that every individual piece fits in that strategy. if you're suddenly flung into a competition with pretty strict, narrow rules, it's very hard to make sure that the strategic intent is really governing it all. So I do think it's not been appropriate. Nevertheless, we have had actually some really good wins from some of the competitions recently, and no one's going to say something like the Levelling Up Fund successful Wolverhampton with the college or Birmingham with the Moseley Road baths hasn't been welcome. But, you know, it's not an efficient way of going about it. So what we have been lobbying government on, and this is, again, cross-party, the CA board has come together on this, is to say we need to move to a single pot model. Now, to be fair to them, in transport, we've taken a big step towards that. So the City Region Sustainable Transport Settlement, 1.05 billion, and to be completely honest, 778 million of new money. That is a single pot for transport. And yes, it'll have to be signed off at the beginning with them, but then we will use a lot of our governance processes to then sign that off. We're arguing for the same in skills. It's been really good in adult education budget where we've had that. But the National Skills Fund, literally I was with Nadeem Zahawi last Tuesday talking about this. And similarly, we've got a really good example in housing, where our housing and land funds negotiated with the previous government, Theresa May's government, they give us tranches of that as we demonstrate our progress. So we've got some good examples, but we want to move to a complete single pot model, if that makes sense, Tony.
That makes perfect sense, Andy. I mean, because the present situation does seem a little bit of a farce. And you know, we need this money as a region, and you know, there should be a better way of getting this money.
That's right.
So yeah, I'm heartened to hear what you're saying about you're looking to change things.
I'm also, I have to say, and I know your leader feels this very strongly, I don't agree with Solihull being in quote tier 3 and Coventry being in tier 2 for these levelling up bids.
Yeah.
Because yes, we know Solihull is a more affluent place than other places, and Coventry obviously relatively. But there are still areas of your borough that desperately need levelling up support, and for you not to be able to apply just isn't right.
Exactly, we've got 3 of the most deprived wards in the area, so it's this thought of Solihull as an affluent place. It is in areas, but so are other areas. I mean, I lived in Walsall for the first 18 years of my life. There are affluent areas of Walsall, some deprived areas. You mentioned one earlier, Birchill's, where I used to live. But there are affluent areas, but are deprived areas as well.
Exactly. So there's a lot to win on this, and this levelling up white paper is really important to us in how this is going to go.
Okay, so I've got Councillor Ali, followed by Councillor McGarity, followed by Councillor Slay. So
Lovely.
Mike, if you want to come in next.
Did you say Councillor Ali? I didn't hear you there. Hello?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm just grateful for Councillor Hare, Good Dev Hare, to answer this question, because I was going to ask that initially. But we've got our reply. But I think you also mentioned about a breakdown. So when can we be awaiting a breakdown from how much Coventry will be received from the budget? Because I can't see it on the paper that we've got.
Have a look on page 9 of the pack, Councillor Ali. It's current context for the WMCA, summary of investment facilitated / influenced by the CA, and it gives per head spend.
That's what I was referring to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. That is, to be fair though, Councillor Ali, that's historical what we've done. In terms of going forward, I mean, the biggest capital allocation piece is absolutely the CRSTS, and that will be clear to all leaders over the next few weeks, actually. But that's
when did we? I think I was actually mentioning, basically stating to that fact, because you did say it will be available. So when will that be available? In a couple of weeks, and when will be received?
That's the CRSTS one specifically. That will come to the board in January.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Councillor McGarity.
Right, thank you, Chair. I wonder, could I move things in a slightly different direction to talk about the Commonwealth Games, or would you prefer to stick with the funding?
Could we bring that in after the transport section?
Yeah, that's fine, absolutely fine. Thank you.
If you could just hold it till then.
Yep,
we've just got one question left on the sustainability of the budget before we move on to transport. So if I can bring Councillor Akhtar in for the final question on the sustainability of the budget, please. Councillor Akhtar.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, it's
right.
to unmute myself. My question is, Andy, around the next mayoral election spending.
Yes.
Funding for the 2024 mayoral election is one of the big amount pushed back from next year to 2024 budget. And seeking to meet the cost of the election in one single year run the risk that funding it may need to be done at the expense of delivering vitally important services. Why have you chosen not to spread the cost of the next election across the 3-year remaining term? Thank you.
Okay, I think it's the first time I've done it, and hopefully it'll be the last this morning. I am going to ask Linda to answer this because I think people will understand. The one thing I am not really allowed to do is think about the mayoral election arrangements. So Linda, that should be for you.
Yeah, so it is a financial planning assumption. It is the way we haven't changed the way that we have normally funded the election. We have actually funded it in the year it was occurred every year, and that's been a discussion and a decision by the leaders in setting the budget. There was originally, I asked the question as to whether or not we wanted to spread the cost over the next couple of financial years. The conversation that we had with leaders was actually, given the uncertainty in next year's budget, we would not choose to do that at this point, because actually we need to pick that up when we look early in the 2022 financial year about the forward sustainability. So it's not something we've forgotten. It's something that we will look at when we do the work with leaders around the future sustainability.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer your question, Councillor Akhtar?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, if we can move on then to transport revenue, because obviously we've already touched on this as being extremely important, and we do have the members of the Transport Scrutiny Subcommittee with us today. So I'm going to hand over to Councillor Clements for the first question.
Thanks, Chair, and morning, Andy, and hello, everybody. And I think if we weren't all here asking you questions, some of us would be out there riding the tram as it started to operate again this morning. That's an excellent news story. But we've already touched on it several times, because I think when we were taken through the budget by Linda, the prospects for transport funding post 22-23 are really alarming, and you've referred several times to the gap. And I think for me, in the meetings of the Transport Scrutiny Subcommittee in the last few months, it's been inspiring to see the emerging local transport plan, the green paper, and all the ambitions that we've got there for decarbonisation, active travel, and transforming the public transport network. But how we're going to deliver on all.
We've lost you, Liz. You've dropped out. Liz? Councillor, okay, Liz, you've frozen completely. No, okay. Looks like she's going to have difficulty reconnecting. So maybe we could, if we go on to the next question, we can come back to Liz.
If you want, Kathy, we can deal with the Commonwealth Games piece swiftly while we just wait for Liz to come back. You're in charge, not me, but that might help.
Yeah, that's fine. Councillor McGarity, do you want to ask your question on Commonwealth Games, and then we'll come back when Liz has got connection.
Yeah, I think Liz does have quite a few problems with getting connected. It's happened quite a few times. But thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andy. One of my questions, in the team have got quite a few questions, is what strategies are in place to ensure safe transportation of the athletes and the spectators within the Commonwealth Games? Clearly, this is because of the tram situation. So it's been highlighted because of that, and also at the same time the train stopped working as well from Wolverhampton, so there was no train, no tram on one day. So I know this is a massive question, but
it is a massive question. How long have we got? Just on the, so okay,
right, thank you.
There's various bits to this. just to have a word about the tram, first of all. Obviously, it was extremely serious, that situation, but the good news is it's come back today, as you say. And just so colleagues know, because I was asked this on BBC WM this morning, is it going to go down next week again? No is the answer, because a permanent repair has been done to a number of the trams that were already running, and we've also brought into service early, and full marks to the engineering team for getting these trams commissioned, the trams that we'd actually already bought for the extension. So we have a mix of those that were running and have been repaired and the new ones. And when we extend to library as soon as we can, that will be more of the new ones coming on stream. So I do believe that will be sustainable, which is very important. The train incident you referred to in Wolverhampton, I think it was an overhead line down on that one day, which was very painful to coincide. I think it was the second day that the tram was down. So that was an absolute horror. You are right. But I think that was a one-off piece of hardware piece, really. But the general point around the Commonwealth Games answer goes like this. And I might ask Laura if she wants to contribute to this as well, because a hell of a lot of work has been done. First of all, we have to make sure that the public transport infrastructure that we have promised for the Games is there and opened on time. And the single two most important things for that are, of course, the Perry Bar station, which is going great guns, and I'm pretty confident we'll be ready with that. And of course, all the sprint works and actually the road works along through Perry Bar. It is, as everybody knows, an obstacle course at the moment, but that is also on target, on time. And I'm also optimistic that we'll get the university station done fully for that Games, even though you may remember it wasn't promised to be fully done for the Games. That is also going extremely well. So the new infrastructure has to be there. The second thing that then has to be done is we have to make sure that the infrastructure that we rely on every day in the city and the region is in good form and is strengthened where need be. And just to give you an example of that, we had a long debate yesterday with the rail companies all about how additional trains will be run, late night services from Perry Bar, how we and thinking about all the venues, not just Perry Bar. So there's a lot of work going on that. And then the third thing that has to be done is thinking about how we actually give the road transport from the villages to the event venues, particularly for the athletes and officials. And this is a huge logistical exercise. If you think everyone's staying at Birmingham University, Warwick University, and indeed a couple of other smaller venues, and they have to be linked to all the different venues. So this is a bus network piece, which great detail is currently going on to. So it is, the bottom line answer is, it is a very, very complex operation, but I'm actually very satisfied with the work that's happening. And just to give you one last reassurance, the organising committee of the Commonwealth Games has asked for Sir Peter Hendy, who was head of transport for London when the Olympic Games was on, so my goodness, he's got the scars, and is now chair of Network Rail, to come and do a review of our state of readiness. And he was actually here on Friday doing that piece of work. And if he identifies any failures, we've still got enough time just to sort that out. So thank you for the question. I hope it's a long answer, but I hope it's reasonably succinct for you on everything we've got to do.
Yeah, thank you. That's very reassuring. And I think to have somebody from the Games, I think, is really, really helpful. Because I was wondering about the Glasgow Commonwealth Games, and I did mention at one of the meetings, maybe somebody from there could speak to the Birmingham team, and I think that's already happened. So
well, that's really interesting, because of course the guy who was the finance director of the Glasgow Games is the CEO of our Games organising committee. So all that learning comes in. And perhaps just another point, Anne Shaw, who is acting managing director of transport of the West Midlands, was with me in the Gold Coast the last Games. And frankly, transport was not good in the Gold Coast. It was their big weakness. People couldn't get back from the opening ceremony. So we know what we've got to do. So we have tried to learn from all of those experiences. But the London experience, because actually transport was bloody good for the London Games, given everyone said it would be a nightmare, it was actually very successful. Things like the games lanes that they did, all that learning is being drawn upon.
All right, thank you for answering that question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
And we have Liz back with us now. So Liz, back to you.
Hi there, everybody. Sorry about that brief interruption there. I don't know how much of that question you heard, Andy, but it was really just focusing on the funding gap beyond 22-23 for transport, and how will we deliver the objectives of the emerging new LTP if we can't close that gap?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Liz. It's a very good question. So the first thing to say is that a lot of the LTP relies on capital to build the new infrastructure, which again, of course, keep coming back to this, but it's such an important point for the committee. That is not what this revenue budget on page 28 talks to. So the critical way we achieve that is using the capital that we've already got, you know, things like the Moseley Kings Heath railway line out to tender last week. That's a separate set of capital. And of course, this forthcoming City Region Sustainable Transport Settlement, where we're just going through exactly what we will build. But for example, the VLR line in Coventry is currently slated to be in that. So there's a whole capital piece to give us the infrastructure for that green network. And I think we all want more, of course we do. But on the whole, we're in a pretty good place on that. We've certainly got far more cash than we ever had before. And just one stat, and I apologise, Lisa, I did use this in the election, but it's true. We've got per head of population about 7 times now what we had pre-2016. So that's can we build the network piece. There is, by the way, a whole point about inflation costs going up in any capital projects at the moment, and that's a real constant issue. And actually coming back to the risk register that we talked about earlier on, that's there. But the far more difficult issue is how we're going to deal with the operational subsidy if the network is not, the patronage is not the same. And just to explain this, because I know members of the Transport Selecting Committee will understand this, but maybe others won't yet. The way this works is really very simple. If the Metro patronage is down, then we have directly to cover the cost difference between the income and the revenue, because we run it directly. If if the rail patronage, I should just go that actually, West Midlands Trains patronage is down, we don't take the risk. Government take the risk. They effectively have nationalised that. They now underpin that. So to answer your question, there isn't a concern over if rail patronage isn't there. Might be longer term. Government might say we're not standing behind this. We're reducing the frequency of services, but it doesn't come into our budget. The really big issue in our budget is the bus patronage, because the way this works is that if National Express suddenly have half of the patronage they might otherwise have expected, obviously many of their routes become loss-making. They choose not to run them as a commercial operation, and we then have the choice of whether we run them as a subsidised route, and that subsidy goes straight into our P&L. So that is the big risk. So the answer to what has to happen is 3 quick things. Number 1, we have to hope that the COVID restrictions pass quickly and we get a recovery in patronage, because that will solve it. Number 2, we have to work with National Express, obviously, to try to, as the predominant operator, to try to minimise the cases where they pass the risk back to us. And then number 3, we have to lobby government for a continuation of the funding to close the funding gap, saying we couldn't possibly have anticipated this. And that last point is very, very live, Liz. So we have put in what we call in our bus service improvement plan, a big ask for revenue closing that gap. And we do not yet know if we're going to get that. Hopefully that's clear how it works.
Yeah, that's good to hear that, Andy, because I think certainly the concern from the transport subcommittee is about the future of the subsidised bus routes and also the non-statutory concession. So it's been good to hear the news about this year's decision for the transport levy, but I think the prospects for the next few years are very concerning. So I hope that the lobbying of government has some success. And on the city region transport settlement, again, I think it's fantastic that we've got a 5-year settlement, that we've got extra money. But I suppose at the risk of sounding as though one's looking a gift horse in the mouth, I think the fact that the settlement was at the lower end of what was expected is disappointing, because I think it still takes us back into the territory where you're going to have to make prioritisation decisions and decide what's not going to be done. And again, I think that comes back to Tony's question about the whole way that that the default authorities are funded.
Yeah, probably worth just saying one other thing on the lobbying government. We're not doing this on our own, of course. Somebody else asked me earlier on about working with other mayoral combined authorities. I mean, frankly, it's exactly the same in London and Manchester and everywhere else, but the public transport networks are just the biggest in London, West Midlands and Manchester. And you'll have heard all the stuff in the press about TfL looking for a bailout. That is exactly them getting sooner to the challenge that we potentially face. Now, obviously, we've never got to the situation where we've asked for bailouts, and TfL have already had 2 this year. No, that might be unfair. 1 this year. But you see it playing out elsewhere. So government know this is a real issue. Second thing on just the CRSTS piece, when you say lower end, it's probably worth just being really precise about this. The range we were given is between 780 million and 1.28 billion. We got 1.05. So we were, I don't think that's quite fair to say lower end. It's sort of just smack in the middle of the range that we were given where we would be. But what is true is that we are also having to bid for the BSIP money, which is separate, and that is where this subsidy issue is really playing out. And I do not yet know how that will play.
But the settlement included some existing funding, didn't it? So things like the highway maintenance block and some other existing funding. But I suppose that is sorry, I don't want to sound as I'm nitpicking, but I think so I think we need to look at what is now possible to be delivered with the money that we have got. I mean, I don't want to crash the sequence of questions. So if this is not the appropriate time to ask Kathy, please stop me. But just in the light of what you said about the revenue challenges and the difficulties we're going to have in maintaining subsidised bus routes when commercial operators withdraw, do you think that has influenced at all how you're thinking about prospects for bus franchising? Because I know that's another thing that we're thinking about at the moment in the context of the bus services improvement plan and everything that's happening. Because for me, public transport is a service that people rely on, and we've for example with the sudden withdrawal of the metro service, people are left without that key service, and I think that should make people reflect on the importance of having a service which is there to serve the needs of the population and not always driven by by the needs of the commercial operators.
And just on the CRSTS money first, because it's not nitpicking, it's a lot of money. We need to be quite straightforward with everybody. So the range was always including that existing funding. So the 1.05 against an upper target of 1.28, that is a fair comparison. But you are right, Liz, and don't mind everybody else having this, and we referred to this very clearly at the last board. There was some money in that we'd already got, already expected to get, is a better way of putting it. So the genuine new money is 778 million. And I think that everyone now agrees that, actually. So that you are right to draw that out, 778. Now, in terms of the wider question, though, you are absolutely right that the bus service is where the biggest risk is, to Lisa's observation about reaching the most disadvantaged communities. It is the bus that serves those communities, not rail. And that's why this is so important in the sort of social justice piece. Now, on franchising then, there will be as well a paper coming to the board. It'll either be January or February, I'm not sure which actually yet, but this whole dynamic of the sustainability of the commercial model will definitely influence what that paper says. I cannot say yet what the conclusion is going to be, but is it in the mix, Liz, to your question? The answer is categorically yes.
That's great to hear, because there's at least a couple of us here in this meeting, myself and Vera, we're regular bus users, and I think we're just the experience I think of using buses at the moment is always not always as one would want it to be. So I think anything that we can do to actually shape the bus service in the way that we want for the future is to be welcomed. But thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Councillor Akhtar, have you got a supplementary question to Lizzie's original question?
Yes, please. This is around CRTS, if you allow me to ask.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. My understanding is, Andy, that most of the money which you'll get through CRTS will be spent on the tram or metro or West Midland Metro, as you called it, although it doesn't serve the whole West Midlands. So I don't know why we call it West Midland Metro. Can you tell me how much money will be spent on the metro and what the other part of the region will get from that fund?
Yeah. I can't tell you how much will be spent on the metro because it hasn't actually been agreed by the board yet. So that isn't a dodge. I'm trying to reflect the governance of the board. However, what I can tell you is this, which is what lies behind your question. There will be some more money in for metro, both physical extensions and also doing the development work on some of the next pieces. Hagley Road, Walsall, Wednesbury, New Cross in Wolverhampton. But the total that will actually be spent is probably is a lot less than we're currently spending. But critically, I accept the point there's none of that for Coventry. So what is currently in the proposals, subject to board sign-off, is that the VLR money will be there, which is Coventry's equivalent of the Metro. And so again, as it currently stands, Coventry looks to be going to get a good deal out of the CRSTS piece. And I have said publicly, and it was in my manifesto, that we would find a way of moving forward the VLR piece, which, by the way, is also advantageous for Dudley, because that's where a lot of the research is done. So I haven't given you the exact number, but what lies behind the question, I can absolutely reassure you that Coventry will be getting, on current proposals, subject to board sign-off, the investment it needs for its equivalent of the Metro.
Okay, thank you. So if I go back to, I've got Councillor McGarity who got a question on the closure of the Metro.
Yep.
Councillor McGarity, do you want to come in on a question on the Metro?
Only that, you know, it wasn't working, basically. That's the only thing that I've got to say. Sorry, no.
No, okay, thank you. Perhaps I can come in then on a further question on Metro and the fare box revenue, if that's okay, Andy. So you've already said that the subsidy for light rail won't be extended past March 2022.
Currently, that's the plan. We're lobbying.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. Given the loss of fare box revenue over the last month, and also given the reduction in revenue because of the reduction in patronage since the start of the pandemic, what impact is that likely to have on fare box borrowing? So when we think about the Wednesbury to Brierley Hill Metro, is that likely to have a negative impact? And what is the contingency plan?
Yeah, okay. So Linda might want to comment on this as well. So the first thing to say is what's happened through the pandemic so far, which was part of your question, will have no impact at all, because that has been made good by government. And you could even say we got a slightly better deal than we might have needed to be completely neutral. But please, no one must quote me on that. But to be absolutely categoric, that has been to the end of this financial year fully covered and will have no impact at all. I think there is just a question about how we deal with the loss for the last month, which Linda might like to comment in. But in the overview of the projection of the borrowing model, that's tiny impact really. But the bottom line is no impact from what's already happened. Now, what really matters is the projection of how this is going to recover what you might call medium term, because the borrowing model was actually run, I think, over 40 years. So it's really long-term piece. But you are absolutely right to say that if that projection is not for a full recovery, the headroom that we've got to borrow against it will be reduced. So we do then have to look to see the impact of that on the capital that we have got to spend. And that is best way of describing that is a very live decision that we've got at the moment. And obviously we will have to potentially use some of the CRSTS money to actually make good some of that shortfall. Is that, so, Linda, do you want to, it's a very important technical question, do you want to add to it, make sure I've described it accurately?
I think you have described accurately, thank you. The short-term impact, as Andy said, is being managed. We're getting government grant for that. We will seek to obviously recover the losses of the current issues we've had over the last 4 weeks. This is about the borrowing model forward and the assumptions, and clearly this is about how transport and travel patterns and people's behaviours and assumptions around how transport is utilised going forward, and therefore the impact on the patronage assumptions in that model. So we are, as you know, and we've spoken about this before, we review this very, very regularly. The current assumptions we are going through at the minute, and we're taking that through governance, and clearly we are looking to bring that through in a series of recommendations as soon as we can through the governance.
So there's absolutely no risk to the extension to the Brierley Hill Metro?
We can't say that yet, Kathy, need to be honest with you, because we have to keep doing the model. And I would be being, I'd be being, what's the word, over reassuring if I said, implied nothing had changed in that model. And that's why Linda correctly says, and Bob might like to comment as well, we have to keep doing that model to examine the funding headroom that we have got. Bob, do you want to add on this? Because it is very important.
Only to add, it is a current discussion, to be fair, Kathy, and we are constantly looking at the model that's been presented to us, and we look forward to the forward borrowing that brings in relation to the fare box. So there's no more that I can say at this point in time, but I can assure you we're spending an awful lot of hours looking at the modelling for the investment of the whole of the metro system. I think that's probably as far as I can go at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I guess it's, you know, from being from the authority that will be most impacted by this, you know, I just want to make sure that it's obviously at the front of everybody's planning, and actually, you know, really championing the cause for Dudley, in that, you know, unless we get the metro, we are not connected to the outside world.
And let me just say, I mean, Linda and Bob have been absolutely accurate, and I've tried to, we have to be. Excuse me, that's the fire alarm at home. It's the peril of working from home on a Wednesday. Anyway, so we have to be absolutely accurate, and we have, but equally, we understand the significance of this to Dudley, and I think people understand that I've made this an absolute priority as well. So yeah, point taken entirely.
Thank you. Councillor Fowler.
Thank you. Good morning, Andy and Bob. I think you kind of virtually said what I was going to ask actually to Andy, because I was looking at page 18 from the details that we had about the funding gap, and Andy's already alluded to on some routes it could be, if they're unviable, potential for subsidies. What I'm looking for, Andy, as well, with your plan that you've had that kind of looks like the underground in London, with that plan, is this potentially slowing down your connectivity plans for the future?
Again, this is where you come to the capital and revenue. If anything, we're accelerating the pace we can do the capital and draw those lines on there. That's the conversation we just had that Liz was drawing out. The issue is the sustainability of some of the social services, which weren't necessarily on that quote unquote underground like map. It's much more the bus services where they are not commercial. That's where the real risk lies.
Does that answer your question, Peter?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Jimmy, I think so. I was quite brief there, but that is straightforward, I think.
No, that was fine, Andy. Very pleased. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So moving on to Councillor Clements then.
Yeah, I think that the next question is really about the future of the non-statutory concessionary fare schemes that we've got in the region, and what assurance can you give to the people that currently use those that they can be maintained in the future, given the current revenue pressures, Andy?
Okay, so this is another point of honesty. The current budget for next year, absolute read my lips, is they're all maintained. And that's the message that must go out from today. The budget maintains all of those schemes. But you can see the deficit. And if we do not, if the deficit comes to pass in future years and we do not raise the levy to deal with it, we will have some choices. And the choices will be the items on that list on page 28. I don't want us to get to that point, but the political decision will come to this. Is it more important to protect those services than to raise a precept, for example? Is it more important to protect those services than keep the levy low, which the metropolitan authorities pay? But absolute read my lips moment. This coming year, they're protected, but that is the political choice that could come in the future.
Thanks.
Councillor Trickett.
I suppose just listening to the debate, one of my concerns is, and it's always the danger of where you're able to leave capital but you have concerns about long-term subsidy or revenue support, that in effect what we might end up doing is skewing the transport network and investment to current programme areas than actually reappraising what is actually the most in need. And it comes back, I suppose, a little bit to that fiscal responsibility question I said at the start. You know, if there is a real risk, and from what you have said, and I really thank you for your honesty, there is a huge risk to potentially Metro Dudley, Metro East Birmingham. And we also have a risk in terms of buses, and buses serve our poorest communities. We absolutely need to ensure that we can connect those people to the jobs. And I am slightly worried now that we could be blindly carrying on with capital investment that actually ties us in to ongoing revenue requirements that actually we should be prioritising elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Lisa. Yeah. So I think the principle behind the question is right. It's very fair. I think I can reassure you on two things, actually. Number one, if you take something like the 5 ways metro extension, just to give an example, the way the funding model works, and Linda might like to come in on this, that the additional capital that we'll have spent on that, because it's likely to be a very densely used part of the network, will actually give us more revenue and therefore more headroom for future investment. So actually, just almost the opposite of what you're implying, but we do have to make sure that we've got that upside rather than the downside that you are describing. And sorry, Lisa, please come back because that's important. Yeah.
Because I think, and again, I get that, that, you know, just on the modelling, you have the high volume things. Where we start to see, and we know from what is actually happening in city centre lets, you know, people, the work from home is actually becoming the mode of the future. So actually our expectations on those high volume routes are going to have to be moderated. So it comes back down to your risks, doesn't it? I want to be in, you know, are we absolutely clear that we are managing the risk that we could be leaving the poorest communities behind?
Well, I think I've given you the answer on the metro modelling piece, and it's why that we were looking literally hawk-eyed at the recovery and patronage every week, and we were really encouraged with the metro numbers before the closure, and be interested to see how it comes back. But then on the bus services piece, that is different. That is the question of the subsidy that we can put onto the routes. Patronage, recovery of patronage is the most important thing. But we're back to the sustainability of that is about the subsidy that we can afford to take.
Okay.
Would it be worth? Is it okay if I just to reassure on the metro network expansion? Most of the metro network expansion is actually funded by government grants and other grants. So it's only the top piece of it that we funded by borrowing. So it's not like we're the whole of the network, the metro expansion is dependent upon the fare box, the ability for us to borrow off fare box. That's not the case. Huge amounts of the majority of that metro network is on grants, and Andy's right that the expansions, the incremental cost and the driver in the patronage is what we're currently looking at. Clearly we were very confident before, but actually we just need to manage that risk and just be a little bit more prudent around looking at how do we think that patronage is going to grow once those lines are expanded, given everything we've just said about the future of travel essentially. But in terms of the rail network, so we'll put capital investment in the rail network, but actually as Andy said earlier, the rail operations is picked up by government, so the cost of operations is just purely capital investment from our perspective, and the same with bus.
I think it's worth just mentioning one other thing around bus that your question draws out, Lisa. So obviously, again, I know colleagues haven't seen all the detail of the CRSTS and the BSIP bid, but there's a lot of money in that actually for improving our bus operations as well. And indeed, some of it's, you know, we've talked before about the first cross city route, the 50 and the 82, 87, Moseley Road and Dudley Road out to West Brom. The idea of that is the capital that we spend on it makes the bus more attractive, so the patronage actually goes up. So in a sense, what we're trying to do there is also get a virtuous circle of capital easing the revenue situation on it. And in the CRSTS, we've got a number of examples of that, which are concentrated on the really heavily used into and out of Birmingham routes to each of the towns around Birmingham. And that is trying, again, to improve the sustainability of the bus model by using capital investment in it. And obviously, everything we're trying to do around ticket prices, we come down on National Express, what's being done around piece in the CRSTS as well about this capping and interoperability between different modes. If we can get that done, that will push bus patronage up as well. So we're trying to address it in that way, Lisa, as well.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Padder who wants to come in.
Good morning, Andy.
Good morning.
Just a question around Metro. Question for me is, when did you become aware of the Metro service you would need suspending? And has the financial implications that's caused been accounted for when preparing for next year's budget, please?
Yeah, with pleasure. So you've asked a very precise question. I'll give you a precise answer, then I'll tell you something else. So when did we become aware that the Metro was going to need to be suspended? On the Thursday evening, which I think was the 12th of November, and the announcement went out on the Friday lunchtime. And that was because the safety advisor changed their advice. So they said on that Thursday, this is going to have to come out. We can no longer give a guarantee that this is safe. So as soon as that was done, I was informed and the action was communicated by MML. So that was literally immediate. If what you mean by your question, though, is when did we know that there was an issue with the cracking on the trams, the answer to that is, of course, around May, we got the first information of that bogey box crack. And then actually we had to be really precise as well. We had back in 2019 a different non-critical issue where there was a crack in the sort of, like, I call it fuselage, like an aeroplane. But all of that we knew about was being managed with the support of the safety advisors saying, yes, what you're doing is right. And then critically, they changed their advice. And that's what led to the service coming out immediately. And they have had to, again, tell us the repair that has been done is sufficient to give us the safety guarantee now.
Thank you. I've got just to wrap up now on transport. I've got a couple of questions from Councillor Vera Waters relating to National Express. Vera.
Hi, Andy.
Hello.
We've already touched on some of this, but I'll go through it again and see if there's anything else you can add to it. West Midlands Combined Authority continue to pay National Express for the concession travel which bears no resemblance to actual concessionary uses. It is in the public interest to extend a multi PLC to bear some unavailable costs, of course, of COVID. If you got that.
Yeah, I have. So the answer on that is you're absolutely right. This has actually been a requirement of government that we pay at the pre-COVID concessionary levels, and actually, I actually think it's the right thing to have done. Because had we not done that, we'd have had National Express telling us they weren't going to operate more of the services, and we'd be back to the subsidy. So it's actually a question of how you choose to pay, and this method has actually helped sustain the very services everyone depends upon.
Right, thank you. Now, my next question: huge amounts of public money is being funded to National Express, but it doesn't seem that it is being dealt with. Sorry, I do apologise. I've lost myself now. I always do this when I'm speaking on Teams. I hate it. Right. I'll start again. Huge amounts of public money is being paid to National Express, but it seems that it is not being done without receiving the data on the economic and social return on investment. For example, it would not be helpful if many public services were after data, concessionary travel, starting with decision in points. Does the current arrangement suggest that alternative relationship with the bus operators in the region is long overdue?
So this, in a sense, is the same question as Liz asked about, does this lead us to look at enhanced partnership or franchising? And I said, yes, that has got to be examined, and that's a decision of the board that we're going to do that. I think, though, I don't want to appear like the apologist for National Express, but I would just offer two thoughts. There is no evidence that the models elsewhere are more efficient than that we have. If you look at our fares compared to anywhere outside London, they are lower. And if you look at the coverage of our network and the number of miles taken by passengers, they're higher. So I'm open to looking at this, and the board will take a paper on this. But I think we've got to be very careful in not understanding that some of what we've got is actually pretty good by the comparison in other areas, and the cost of a franchise is very, very high.
Yeah, the thing is, can I just come back on that, Chair?
Yeah.
Now the thing is, I mean, I don't drive, so I constantly use public transport, and I go Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Walsall, obviously, and I can actually see little things that could actually be changed that aren't being done right. And it's a case of, I do email across to National Express to point these out, and none of the points ever get taken on. Nothing ever changes.
That is disappointing, and I think Anne's not on the call, but we'll make sure it's picked up, because they're supposed to have a customer panel. You sound like the perfect person to be on this. So
yes, I'd love to.
That's what we will organise. Then they'll have to.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. Okay.
So I've got two further contributors, Councillor Akhtar and then Councillor Clements.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, Andy, do you agree with me that it is wrong to run a public service through a private company? We all know the private companies. I'm talking about the Transport of West Midlands. We all know the private company always put the profit first before the customer, and I always push for a in-house service. You know what I mean? So do you agree with me? Is it wrong to run a public service?
So we could have a long debate about this. Not necessarily is the answer to your question. So let's be clear. We have not just got a private operator running amok. We've actually got a private operator which is very closely regulated, works with us in a collaborative way. It's how we've got the concessionary structure that we have. It's how we've got the subsidised routes that we have. So if it was pure private and enterprise with no working with us, I wouldn't support that. But it's sort of what I was saying to Vera. We've actually got this enhanced partnership which has delivered a lot, and we must be very, very wary about moving away from it in terms of what we'd lose. And that isn't meant as a defence of National Express. I'm sure they fail in many ways, and yes, of course, they've got to make a return for their shareholders, but equally we've got to be very, very careful about just being critical of them.
I've got Councillor Clements next.
It's just a comment, really. I think we've all got to be honest, because I mean, like Vera, I'm a regular bus user, and I think the biggest disincentive to using buses is congestion and the amount of time that it takes to get anywhere by bus. And I think that the challenge that the government's issued to local authorities to actually focus on bus priority is absolutely essential, because you've talked about the new cross-city bus lines, which I think is a great development, but that's happening at the same time as we've had to split up the 11 route because it is simply so slow. And I do a lot of journeys across across, you know, the South Birmingham suburbs, and they are really agonisingly slow. So I can see that if you've got the opportunity to use a car, you will use it. But then it's a vicious circle, isn't it? Because everyone is just sitting in traffic, you know. And if we're in cars, you know, I take taxis, I need to get lifts, you know, so I'm also part of the traffic. But every time you're in a private car on your own, you are part of the traffic. So the more, you know, the more prioritisation that we can give to buses on our routes, you know, the quicker we're going to solve this problem. And I think we can't keep on ducking that issue.
I am, well, the Deputy Mayor and I are absolutely with you. As you probably know, neither of us drive around the city region either, and we use public transport, so we're with you. But this is why, again, why I said in answer to something from Lisa, that the capital invested in bus prioritisation is part of the answer to this. And we are doing okay. We're actually making some progress. I mean, there's evidence from Solihull where they've done a very good job on bus prioritisation into the town centre, and that has actually driven the utilisation of buses into the town centre up well. Before the pandemic, our utilisation of buses was going up, not down. So we've got to get back to that virtuous circle, really. So yeah, I agree with you strongly.
That's good. Let's hope we can keep the cross-party consensus about bus priority. If we could keep it going in all sorts of other discussions, I'd be absolutely over the moon.
And by the way, the number 11 is a terrible failure, but it is the works in Perry Bar. And as soon as those works are over, they've got to restore that, as it's so, you know, it's iconic, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's one of the first things I did when I moved to Birmingham, is to go around the whole route. So I look forward to being able to do that. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Councillor Hare to bring in, and then we're going to move on to the environment questions. Councillor
Hare. Thank you, Chair. And we've been touching public transport buses, and I mean, taxis also public. You haven't touched that. And at the moment, we try to bring the black cab on the road, which is costing £75,000, you know, the electric taxi. You haven't mentioned how we can subsidize them to bring more black cab and electric taxi on the road. So far, we are not successful to bring the electric taxi on the road. Have you got any proposal, any investment, or any suggestion? Are you open to it to bring these cab? This is just a transport, you know, so we're just ignoring them.
Yeah, okay. So interesting, because the thing in Coventry on buses, and it links to the environment piece we've not talked about, is the all electric city stuff. So, I mean, that's really exciting for Coventry. And I raise that because, back to Liz, your point, the other thing we know, if the vehicle is really good quality, new, as they will be in Coventry, and clean, people want to ride them, and that will drive the ridership up. To taxis, the answer is we have not taken the responsibility for that thus far. That has all been a local authority piece. Both the licensing and the subsidy on the upgrades are local authority deals. And I don't want to appear slopey shoulders, but to the point right at the beginning of the call, we shouldn't be stepping into things where the local authority are responsible. My personal view about it, though, is that there is a really good economic case for subsidising drivers to upgrade, a scrappage scheme, and I wish we could persuade the government of the case for that, because it is the right thing to do environmentally.
Okay, thank you.
I know you're pointed in that, but that's the situation. We are not responsible.
Thank you. The next set of questions are, we've got two on environment. So we've very nearly come to the end of the set of questions, which I'm really pleased we've managed to get in the 2 hours. So we've got two on environment for Councillor Fowler. We do have one on adult education and skills if we get time to get to it, but we'll take the environment questions next, please, Councillor Fowler.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, two questions. And will the recently passed Environmental Act, some 280 pages I saw, bring with it new powers and funding to the combined authority, Andy?
Interesting. It might bring new responsibilities. Whether we actually get any funding and powers remains to be seen, Peter. Right. But there is, and I think we touched upon this in the policy questions. Actually, there is a requirement for combined authorities to work with local authorities on air quality plans. So yes, there will be a new area of responsibility there. and leaders have discussed this, and there will be work going to the next board, I believe, in terms of how we want to step into that. Now, the obvious point is we haven't been idle over this, because lots of the investment in clean transport is partly about addressing air quality issues. So, and of course, I know there's a difference between the air quality issues and the carbon emissions issues, but we specifically are asked to have a plan now around air quality. So that will be a new responsibility. I don't think, unless you correct me, Peter, it is clear what funding will go with that responsibility. And this is always a trap, frankly. It's all very well having power, but unless you have cash to go with it, you can't do much.
Absolutely. Actually, quite nicely sinks into my second question with the Combined Authorities Carbon Reduction Strategy as our UM 2041 when it was adopted. Does your proposed budget generally allocate the sufficient resources necessary to deliver the 2041, or is its success going to be reliant on funding from other sources to help the obviously EV with cars, energy, air quality, which you just alluded to? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I think the answer to this goes right back to the beginning of the debate, actually. So what our budget does, the revenue, is it builds the capability in the combined authority to then make things happen. But it does not have anywhere near the actual cash that is needed then to deliver, to actually fund all the programs that are going to be required. So let's think around carbon emissions. There's a huge piece around transport. The biggest thing that we could probably do is win the gigafactory and be the producer of electric vehicles. So, and what the CA's piece around that is, it's got to actually, along with Coventry City Council in this case, do the legwork on making the case. And yes, the resources are in place to do that. Then on the sort of decarbonisation of transport, the teams in Transport for West Midlands who are actually procuring the new routes, design the new vehicles, designing the cycleways. Yes, the funding is there to do that, but it doesn't actually have the capital for buying the buses, for example, because that's done elsewhere through a third party. And then, of course, the third example is the retrofitting, which is probably, I think, for the whole region, like every other region, the single biggest problem. And we've built a sort of expertise in the centre that we call, jargon word, Smart Hub. So it's a small group of experts who are actually working with local authorities on their bids, then to bring in cash to do the retrofitting. And again, it's nowhere near sufficient, but we did get 19 million confirmed yesterday. And I think all of our local authorities would say working with this expertise in the centre has helped them. So it's got enough cash for building our capability. What we've then got to do is bid for lots of funding to do what needs to be done, if that makes sense, Peter.
And of course, the second thing you mentioned down to bids, and as we mentioned earlier on, Andy, about having to do all this bidding rather than into a single model. And of course, I would imagine as well with all the local authorities within the combined authority, partners and other companies, that will help, I think, to generate better partnership working, as we already are doing, but hopefully that'll be a cash generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touch on a very important point as well. The private sector contribution to this is vast. So if you take the industrial base, no combined authority or local authority is actually going to pay for changing the way in which our industry operates. But if we again can become a sort of centre of expertise, which is a really good example of this through Energy Capital, which is an arm's length body of combined authority, then advising industries in the Black Country, where we are a national pilot for the decarbonisation of some of those heavy energy users there. It's another great example of we don't actually do it ourselves, but we have that expertise that then gets other people to do it and pay for it. In this case, the private sector.
And just finally, building on that, if I may, Andy, it's for me, and I think Councillor Trickett as well, we also look to companies, LAs, to look at the green infrastructure as well to help to reduce carbon even further. We see lots of buildings with flat roofs, and we know that that will certainly help the carbon emissions. Lisa, I'm sure she's coming in and will, hopefully she'll agree.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, I don't need to respond, Peter, in the interest of time. Point well taken. You're right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got one final question left on the adult education budget skills section. So, Councillor Padder, do you want to come in and ask the final question on that?
Yep. Good morning, Andy.
Hello.
The CA has devolved powers to allocate the adult education budget across the region.
Yes.
How has the devolution been utilised to ensure that the local skills needs are being targeted, or has the CA continued to funnel money at the same delivery partners that the Department for Education did?
Yeah.
What has owning this developed budget enabled us to do differently? Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Actually, there's been a lot of change here. The approach was quite softly at the beginning, because obviously institutions had their funding streams and we didn't want to sort of lead to immediate difficulties. But over, I think it's 3 full years now, quite a lot of change has happened. So I'll just give you one stat that I think you will be quite struck by. We had, I think it was 400 contracts applied in the West Midlands, and as you say, centrally. And that has been with lots of people from outside the West Midlands running the contracts. We've reduced that number down to about 50. So there's been an enormous consolidation, and we've tried to make sure that the huge majority of that is held by West Midlands colleges, businesses, whatever. So in terms of the change, there's been, you can all imagine, just going through that process has been very testing, but the team have done it brilliantly, frankly, and there's been very little jip about it. The second thing to say is I think there's been a real change in improvement in what we are focusing on, which comes right to your question. So a lot more is going on level 3 technical skills that will get people into work. And that's been very much agreed with our colleges as to what the changing structure of provision should be. And obviously in the background is the link to what we think business needs. So some of the programmes have been designed with particular sectors in mind where they're growing, like the automotive sector, for example. So that level 3 piece, really important. And then in terms of outcomes, now I can't say this is directly the result of devolution, but what I can reassure you of is the qualification level of the workforce across the region has actually stepped forward quite dramatically. So just in the last year, another 70,000 people were qualified to level 3. And we're now at 56% of the population qualified to that good entry level. So there is absolutely no question in my mind that there has been a lot of change navigated, and the outcome is a continuing improvement in the skill level, which has got to be encouraging for people's future.
Thanks very much for that, Andy. And I don't wish to put Kashmir on the spot, who I'm guessing is representing the Young Combined Authority this morning. But Kashmir, is there any comment that you would like to make just on this particular issue to Andy, perhaps reflecting around NEETs or apprenticeships?
Well, thank you, Kathy, for bringing me in, and thank you. It's been fascinating. Nothing does spring to mind at the minute, but it's certainly, I think it is something that we as a YCA, as a new and updated YCA board, are going to be looking at going through the year, and whatever contact and I think stuff we could have with yourselves would be very interesting. I've had COVID over the last couple of weeks, so it's been a bit of a slow one to get back at the speed with these things, but certainly would be fascinating to have a look and see what we can do.
Thanks for that, Kashmir, and hope you're feeling better. You certainly sound like you're well on the road to recovery. I think it is worth perhaps the YCA being able to pick those issues up with the team, because I think there's still some serious issues around not only the Kickstart programme, but then the amount of apprenticeships that have been taken up, or the amount of apprenticeships that aren't being taken up. And certainly the NEETs, you know, we all know the difficulties young people have faced over the last 2 years, and to make sure that that doesn't have a long-term negative impact. So I think that's absolutely something.
Do you mind if I just chip in, Kathy?
No, of course not. Come back on it.
I gave you a very positive stat. There are some pretty negative stats for the region as well here, and we need to be honest about this. So I would hugely welcome, and I know the skills team would, a proper dialogue with the YCA about what is being done. So yeah, hugely welcome that.
Right, thanks, and hopefully you'll be able to take that forward for us, Kashmir. Okay, that brings us bang on to the 2 hours, to the minute. So thanks everybody for your participation. Andy, is there any closing comments you would like to make?
I'm just going to say congratulations to the chair. Brilliant timing, brilliant to get through everything on the nose. Brilliant. But I mean, to everybody, thank you for your questions. I think it's been a genuinely good dialogue. To Bob and to Linda, thank you for your support, of course. They're the people who do this day in, day out. I just appear occasionally in front of it, but Bob has a grip of every detail of this with Linda. So thank you both for your part. But I genuinely think good dialogue, and we know where we've got some work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously we're going to continue with our meeting for half an hour to pull together our observations, which will go forward for the board in January. And obviously the reflections from yourself on those observations will come back to us. But certainly thank you for your level of honesty in many areas this morning, and certainly in some of the areas of the difficulties and the challenges that we're facing. So thank you for your attendance. And I'll just give people a few moments just to sign off, and then we'll continue for 30 minutes with the rest of our meeting. Thank you.
Bye.